Working Cows Podcast, episode 288. This episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the C90 Ocean Minerals Studios. Very excited to be joined today by Gabe Brown once again, and for the first time, Shane New. We're going to be talking to them today about the nutrient cycle and managing the nutrient cycle. And we've talked to the guys from Understanding Ag on previous episodes of the podcast, and we've been talking to them about the state of American agriculture, and then a broad overview of what they call the 6, the 3, and the 4. And that's the 6 principles of soil health, the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship, and the 4 ecosystem processes. One of those ecosystem processes is the nutrient cycle, and so we're going to take a deep dive on that today with Gabe Brown and Shane New. Gabe, Shane, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
Well, thank you, Clay. It's good to be with you today.
Yes, thank you, Clay. Appreciate it.
So we are on to the third episode in this partnership with Understanding Ag, and we talked about the 6 principles of soil health and the 3 rules of adaptive stewardship and the 4 ecosystem processes in the second episode. And in the first episode, we talked about the state of agriculture in North America. And so here for this third episode, I guess, Shane, I'd like to ask you, what is the nutrient cycle? We kind of touched on it in that 4 ecosystem processes, but we're going to start there today. What is the nutrient cycle?
Yeah, the nutrient cycle, I mean, you can get complicated with the thought process, but, I keep things pretty simple. And we got to think of it as, the big fish eats the little fish. It's how things are constantly being cycled, whether it be nitrogen, carbon, or, whatever nutrient we're looking for. But it's nature's way of continuously, as something dies, it cycles back through in order for something else to live.
So then the nutrient cycle, I think you said the big fish eats the little fish. And we talked, as I said in an earlier podcast, about the role of biology and the importance of diverse biology under the soil, with protozoa and their role in unlocking the nutrients that are locked up in the parasites in the bacteria. And so, what is the biology's role in the nutrient cycle? What are they doing to help that nutrient cycle along?
Oh, that's a great question, Clay. So really, probably in the last 15 years, we've started to really acknowledge the soil microbiology on a broad spectrum now. And, it's these organisms within the soil. And in fact, in a teaspoon of healthy soil, there's many microorganisms as there are humans on Earth. So it's a very, very robust community within the soil. But the bacteria and fungi, they play a pretty critical role in decomposition of biomass, especially, the roots of the past vegetation, and also the above ground biomass, cycling that nutrient that's immobilized within that vegetation and, using that as a nutrient need for their own bodies. But then obviously those nutrients now again are immobilized in the bacteria and fungi. And the only way those nutrients get cycled back out, is either through lysis, they perish and other organisms capture it, or predation from things such as, protozoas, nematodes, and other microarthropods that capture those nutrients and, meet their, daily nutrient needs and, release the excess back out into the soil to be captured again and cycled again.
And I think that when I first started this journey, I would hear people, experts say things like in a double handful of soil, there are as many microorganisms as there are people on the planet. And now there's more people on the planet than there were then. And you're telling me that it's in a teaspoon of healthy soil. There are more microorganisms than there are people on the planet. And I think that's just a picture of how quickly our understanding of all that's going on in the soil is progressing and ramping up. Would you say that understanding of that underground community has expanded in the years that you guys have been aware of it?
Exactly. I mean, I don't think we'll ever understand it fully. I mean, we're discovering new information. It seems like almost on a weekly basis of the role of biology and the symbiotic relationships the biology plays with other diversity of microbiology and also with plant communities. So, I mean, that's the beautiful thing about regeneration or regenerative agriculture. It's a continuous learning, experience. We'll never know it all, but it's fun in my aspect of, trying to capture how nature really does function. And as farmers and ranchers, how we can, be profitable from the understanding.
Yeah. If I may, so one of our friends and technical advisors, Dr. David Johnson, makes his living identifying these species of biology. And it's fascinating to listen to him when he discusses that, biology, because of just how rapidly the generations occur, it can adapt very quickly. And he's identified species of microbiology that can break down gold. Or he uses as an example, look at Chernobyl and that nuclear disaster that occurred there, and how biology is remediating that toxic ecosystem and bringing it back to one that is repairing and healing itself.
I think I've heard other people say that mycorrhizal fungi can dissolve rocks, essentially. That, I mean, it's we think of it as weak because it's small, but that's just our bias, right? It's incredibly strong in its ability to process nutrients.
Yeah, and actually what is happening there is we talked in the last podcast about root exudates and how plants exude root exudates to attract biology. So the biology running its life cycle will provide nutrients for the plants. Well, not all of those root exudates are consumed. Mycorrhizal takes some of them, and then mycorrhizal fungi, that these carbon compounds are excreted. They combine with water to form a mild form of carbonic acid, and that's what breaks down the parent material. Here on my ranch, we haven't used a pound of synthetic fertility since 2007. And I hear over and over again people telling me, well, yeah, you can plant legumes to help you get cycle nitrogen, but you're going to run out of phosphorus and potassium. And I just laugh at them. I say, when the fungi reach China beneath me, it's not going to happen. It's impossible because the nutrients are there. And, maybe Clay, we should take, and Shane, we should take just a moment and talk about where we're at in agriculture and the fact that we're so heavily reliant on these synthetic nutrients for fertility that we've ignored the natural nutrient cycle, and we're actually making our farms, our soils, more reliant on them. And we're kind of like the hamster on the wheel, we're chasing a higher yield. And so what's happening is we apply more synthetic fertility, and that actually has a negative effect, doesn't it, Shane?
Absolutely. So when there's excess nutrient in the soil profile, I mean, the plant doesn't have to exude any root exudates to attract associations with that soil microbiology. And I mean, kind of get into this aspect, nature doesn't waste energy if it doesn't need to waste energy. And why would a plant I'm not saying waste, but why would a plant provide root exudates into the soil profile if it doesn't need to do it? So one of the unintended consequences of a lot of synthetic nutrient application is the plants, aren't making those associations, and especially with mycorrhizal fungi. I mean, obviously, mycorrhizal fungi was a very important part of these ecosystems, for eons and eons. And, as we do a lot of soils testing throughout North America, we look to see if there's still a mycorrhizal presence. And it's very minimal. In fact, it's almost sad. A lot of soil samples I look at, there's zero measurable mycorrhizal within that soil. Now, these are a lot of annual systems, but, we've destroyed something that was a huge component at one time, and we've almost obliterated it out of the system.
Yeah, I talked about that on the previous podcast, how above every surface acre of Earth, there's approximately 32,000 tons of atmospheric nitrogen. I really have a difficult time. I'm just going to say this bluntly. Clay knows me. He knows how I speak. I have a difficult time feeling sorry for farmers who complain about fertilizer prices being so high, and then they're not doing what they can to positively affect the natural nutrient cycle. They don't have the diversity in the crop rotation with legumes to cycle nutrients. They don't have the diversity where they can propagate those populations of mycorrhizal fungi, which will help them access more nutrients. And they will say, well, that's because I have to get higher and higher yields. Well, as we discussed on our first podcast, that's a vicious cycle you don't want to go on. I always contend we should not be given awards for the highest yield. We should be given awards for the highest profitability, and I think and the good that can be had for ecosystem function. That's what we should be doing. I use this analogy. A number of years ago, one of the organizations brought one of the record yield award winners for corn to Bismarck, North Dakota to speak. And at that time, corn was selling for around $3 a bushel, $3.50 maybe. And the guy spoke about his high yield and all his inputs and how he got that. And afterwards in the Q&A, I asked him, I said, what did it cost you to produce a bushel of corn? And he said about $7. And I loudly said, well, I have no desire to learn how to lose money. That just makes no sense. Here we were having a guy come and speak who had spent so much on inputs that he was losing money. And you look at what's going on today. I mean, today we have land rents approaching $500 an acre in some states. We have input costs, approaching $1,000 an acre. It's just ridiculous, but they're not willing to learn about the natural nutrient cycle. That's just doesn't make sense to me.
Right. And so the biology plays a key role in this nutrient cycle. But we've got to figure out if we've got biology to do that work first. So how do we do that? How does one determine if they have the biology that they need in their soil?
Well, we can blow it to kingdom come, and there's always going to be bacteria. They are pretty resilient. So, but if I was a farmer, rancher, and I was one to kind of determine, where I'm at with my soil microbiology, it's a pretty complicated tool, Clay. It's called a shovel. And basically walk out into the field and, stick that tile shovel, preferably, into the soil and pull that soil structure back and look at your roots of the plants that are growing there and see if those roots are engulfed with silt, sand, clay particles. Are you able to see any of the root itself? Is the root white? Is the root filled with, the silt, sands, and clay particles? If it's filled full of silt, sand, and clay particles, there's a good good observation that, you got biology functioning because the plant's producing root exudates. The biology is basically feeding on those root exudates, but in return, it's not a one-way street here. The biology is providing nutrients back that the plant's looking for. Another thing, I always like to do is look at different systems. Go look at an annual cropping system and go look at a perennial system. Then go look at maybe a woodland system and stick the shovel in the soil. And one thing I really like to observe is, do I see that cottage cheese appearance in the soil, that soil aggregation? If I'm seeing nice soil aggregation, that's telling me not only do I have a decent bacterial biomass, I've also got some fungal biomass functioning because it takes that fungal component to help build that larger aggregate structure that we can look at and see. That small pea-looking aggregate along those roots, along the rhizosheaths. So it's telling me I've got some good functional diversity within that soil. And, I think we've lost a lot of understanding of, way soils were meant to function. I know when I went through high school and college and even when I was farming, we tried to engineer water. It was all about building terraces, move the water off the field. And, never did I ever hear once, the soil should actually infiltrate water, and then be slowly released back out into the system. We were always trying to get the water out of the field as rapidly as possible, in order to get back in and plant or inhibit, the plants from drowning in the water within the soil. So that aggregate that I'm referring to, the only way that gets built is through the soil microbiology. There's no other way. But that aggregate is what allows for water to infiltrate deeper into the soil profile. And not only that, it helps oxygen diffuse deeper in the soil profile. Because a lot of this biology we are referring to is aerobic. It needs oxygen. So as we build that aggregate, not only are we infiltrating more water in the soil, and as Gabe mentioned, all the nitrogen that's in the atmosphere, not only has oxygen diffusing into the soil, but also that nitrogen, that dinitrogen. And there are bacteria that can break that nitrogen bond that don't need an association with a plant, such as azobacter, that can release that nitrogen back into the soil profile. So when we refer to the nutrient cycle, it really goes back to building that soil aggregation. The plant feeding root exudates to the microbiology is starting to build that aggregate, which helps with the water infiltration, which helps the biology become mobile. Because most of the biology we are referring to work in a subaquatic environment. The only way they can become mobile is swim on the films of the water within the soil. And that allows for predators such as the protozoas, nematodes, to find those rhizosheaths where all that bacteria and fungi are, to start taking the nutrient that's immobilized within their bodies, to start to consume them and mineralize that nutrient back out right there along that rhizosheath of that root, making those nutrients now plant available that the plant can capture and utilize.
Shane, we got a couple different things here. Because you just mentioned those two terms, I think we should talk about mineralization and immobilization and the difference thereof.
Yeah, so immobilization is referring to that, think of a plant. So a plant has nutrients, with inside of it. Those nutrients are now immobilized. They're tied to carbon with inside the plant. The only way that becomes mineralized is something consumes that vegetation, breaks those carbon bonds, and utilizes the next organism, utilizes for its own metabolic needs. Now the nutrient becomes immobilized again, potentially, for the body structure of the next organism. The excess is released back out into the system. So that's, mineralization is the release of the nutrients. Immobilization is the tying up of the nutrient.
Yeah. And one of the things, I'll just expand on that a little bit. We really see, as we go out and work with clients, The majority of new clients that come to us are over applying nutrients. They're putting on too much. So the first thing we need to do is do proper soil testing. And so, Shane, let's talk a little bit about the soil test, what soil tests are recommended and what they tell us.
That's a great point, Gabe. We need the right tools to start, how do we start reducing some of these nutrients? One test we utilize frequently is the Haney soils test. And what I find remarkable about the Haney soils test is Dr. Haney, kind of asks the question, what does a plant use to capture nutrients from the soil? So plants produce organic acids, but there are three primary organic acids that all plants produce. And that's oxalic, malic, and citric. So they use those three acids in the test, but they also use nature's solvent. And nature's solvent's water. So basically those three acids, along with water, is what, when your soil test is done at the lab, applied to extract the nutrients from your silt, sands, and clays. So the nutrients that are extracted from your silt, sands, and clays are actually the same nutrients that your plant would be able to capture from your soil sample. So your calcium, magnesium, sulfur, but what also it takes into consideration is the soil microbiology. We look at the respiration of the soil to tell us how much biologically do we have occurring within those soils. We'll also look at all forms of nitrogen that a plant can utilize. So when we take these tests, the test is derived from the same thing nature uses, the plant uses, plus water. And that's how the test is captured. This is how we start working with clientele of helping reduce nutrients.
Now, let's compare that, Shane, to your standard soil test, where, 99% of producers who are soil testing are using a standard soil test. What does that entail?
On a standard soils test, Melrick and Braid test, they use caustic acids. So pH is a lot of times, 2.7 and maybe even lower to extract the nutrients from your silt, sands, and clays. So, I heard a question, and I think Lance Gunderson's the one that asked the question, if your soils were a 2.7 pH, would you even have a plant growing? So why would we want to use those caustic acids to measure the nutrients within our soils?
Yeah, that's the whole point. So producers are taking those soil tests, and then also they're only showing them the inorganic fraction of nutrients that are available, correct? In other words, what could be available to the plant the day that sample was taken. How does that compare to the Haney test?
Well, just let's talk about nitrogen here real quick. There's many forms of nitrogen a plant can take up. Obviously the inorganic, your nitrate and ammonium. Your standard soils test is going to show you usually just your nitrate form of nitrogen. But the Haney also takes into consideration, a lot of other things, such as the organic fraction, maybe amino acids, protein structures. Plant can take up amino acids and reassimilate them into proteins. And there's times they can actually take protein structures up and to utilize for metabolic needs.
So what you're really saying is that the standard soil tests that are being used do not give us the complete picture, correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So because of that, many producers are over applying, particularly nitrogen.
Absolutely. And nitrogen, it's a really amazing, even in some very degraded soils, there's still, a significant amount of plant available nitrogen within that soil profile. Now, one caveat to that is that nitrogen, that is plant available nitrogen from that Haney soils test. The question is that nitrogen going to be available for that production crop that you're trying to grow at the time it really needs it? And that's really going to go back and reflect what the CO2 respiration is in the soil. And the best analogy I can come up with is, let's say we want a house built in the next 30 days. and there's a house, the same square footage on both sides of the road. One side of the road, the same materials, but has one carpenter. The other side of the road, same materials, but it has 10 carpenters. So which house is going to get built in 30 days? Probably the 10 carpenters. So that's going to be a reflection of the CO2 respiration. If I have enough workers within my soil to help convert some of that maybe organic form of nitrogen into the inorganic form, or make that nitrogen available when that plant needs it, that's where we can start taking some pretty good credits from that soils test.
Mm-hmm. And that's really good. So you use that test as the basis. What other tests do you use?
There's several tests we'd like to look at. I mean, the other one's called the phospholipid fatty acid test, and I kind of refer to this as, when you go buy a vehicle, usually you pop the hood to see what's underneath the hood for an engine, and that's kind of what the PLFA is to me, the phospholipid fatty acid. I want to take a peek underneath the hood of the soil to see what we have for microbiology as a percent of the biomass of the sample. So we look at diversity as one of the aspects we look at from the PLFA. And diversity, we know diversity is important. Above ground diversity, think of your local community. Most thriving communities, we have school teachers, we have doctors, we have plumbers, we have carpenters, we have a whole gamut of skills and people who have a diversity to make things happen. The same in the soil. We want that diversity within the soil structure itself of bacteria, fungi, predators. And so the PLFA test tells us what we have for bacterial as a percent of our biomass. It tells us what we have for fungal, and also it tells us within that fungal community, do we have a presence of mycorrhizal within the soil? Then it goes in to lets us know if we have a predator presence, such as protozoa. So we can take a look at that sample using the Haney and the PLFA to kind of determine where we are at with our soil at that moment. And then through those tests, help work with a client, a farmer, a rancher, on how to start advancing their system, balancing maybe cover crop mixes, crop rotations, and how do we start building this nutrient cycle back?
Mm-hmm. So part of this is that if we are adding synthetic fertility, we are shutting off. We're telling the soil to shut off the production of certain other nutrients in the soil, and so we're sending these mixed signals and not getting the performance that we could be getting underneath the soil. And so that's one part of this discussion. Am I right?
Well, that's true, but probably more specifically is that nutrient a lot of times is getting tied back up into microbial biomass, especially nitrogen. The microbiology is going to capture that nitrogen form and use it for metabolism. So now we just immobilized it. And if we don't have predation occurring, we're just going to lose it.
Yeah. Well, that's the key there. We'll lose it.
And a lot of it.
So you're exactly right, Clay. It's kind of like telling your wife and kids, sorry, no vacation this year because I have to buy synthetic fertility, right? Instead of relying on the natural nutrient cycle.
And I've heard that a lot of our soils are bacterially dominated. Is this the reason why? Is this one of the reasons why? Is because the synthetic fertility is getting tied up in that microbiology and not getting released as the protozoa and the other things come by and I don't know if cannibalize is the right word, but come by and eat those underground biology that has it tied up within it?
Well, probably more specifically, probably the reason we've lost a lot of diversity, is past management practices. Tillage is very destructive to the soil microbiome, especially the fungal aspect of it. And then we promote, an environment for species like bacteria that can thrive, and even in anaerobic conditions, bacteria can thrive very well. But a lot of the management is what's inhibited the diversity, especially the mycorrhizal and the fungal component in our soils.
Yeah.
It's probably contributed more than anything else.
Yes, it's a combination of, Shane's right, past management, the tillage, the over application of nitrogen, over application of other synthetics, lack of diversity in the crop rotation, not capturing enough solar energy, not bringing enough carbon in. I mean, there's a lot of blame to go around there, Clay.
To be honest with you, our annual cropping systems and that lack of living root in the soil is probably a huge contributor also.
Yeah. Back to that, the 6-4 or 6-3-4. You get, all those pieces are important parts of it, and they're all contributing. When we lack any one of them, they're all contributing to these issues. And so the path forward to increasing the biology in the soil with regard to these things is it's implementing the 6-3-4. But would you have more to say on that?
Well, I mean, yeah, we can. How deep do you want to go, Clay? So, I mean,
let's, Shane, before we jump into that, let's just wrap up a couple of the other tests that we do, and that'll build a good foundation for that. So the next test is the TND test. I'll just talk about that one a little bit. And TND stands for total nutrient digestion. And that's a soil sample that is taken from 0 to 12 inches. It's soil core 0 to 12 inches deep. And it tells us the total amounts of both inorganic and organic nutrients in the soil. Interestingly enough, so Understanding Ag, consulting on over 33 million acres. Shane, how many TND tests, farms, ranches have we run into and sampled that do not have enough nutrients for profitable production?
None as of yet.
None as of yet. So this is hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around, and it was us too starting out, but we did one project where we worked with 45 different farms here in the Northern Plains up into the prairie provinces of Canada. And we sampled 45 farms for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and then trace minerals. So on those 45 farms, Clay, the average pounds of nitrogen in the top 12 inches of the soil profile was 9,000 pounds per acre. 9,000 pounds. Yet the farmers were all still applying nitrogen. The average phosphorus, 2,300 pounds. Average potassium, 11,000 pounds. It was absolutely mind-blowing. So one of the reasons that we like to see a farmer or rancher take a TND test is to give them the confidence the nutrients are there. Our soils aren't lacking in nutrients. They're lacking in biology. Now, I don't want to give anyone the wrong opinion. You cannot just, if you've been fertilizing your soils, you cannot just go and quit using the synthetics, or you'll have a wreck because you don't have the biology and the diversity there to make those nutrients available. Shane, anything else you want to add?
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's building that biology back within those soil systems and getting those nutrients to cycle again.
Yep. And the final test that we recommend is that wet aggregate stability test. Shane, do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, so I love this wet aggregate stability test. We look at the macro aggregate and we look at the micro aggregate. And I use the aggregate stability test as basically my report card. How good a job did I do applying the 6 principles, utilizing the 3 rules? And at the end of the day, my report card per se is how good a job did I do building aggregation within these soils? Because I know how much that aggregation influences water infiltration. It's going to start to influence my nutrient cycle. It's going to start creating my system to start functioning again on its own. So the aggregate stability test is a test we like to capture. We like to look at the macro aggregate versus the micro aggregate. And our goal is to build the larger aggregates we can.
when when do we use these tests? Does it change from time of the year to a time of the year? Is your Haney test going to say something different in the spring of the year than it does in the fall or the winter? Or when do you guys recommend using these tests?
That's a good question. So we encourage producers, especially if we're looking at nutrient management, to take these tests once soil temperatures are close to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. And then, that's all. It's going to depend upon what part of the, where you live, the time of year that will occur. I'd like to see the soil temperatures close to 55, if not 55 degrees, to do the Haney soils test. And that same collection you do for the Haney soils test, you can capture your PLFA test from. We like to take that as a 6-inch core sample. If you do take that soil test deeper, make sure you acknowledge that on your paperwork, that you did a 0 to 8 or a 0 to 10 for your Haney soils test so they can adjust the calculations. Now, the total nutrient digestion test, the TND, that's a 12-inch core sample. And you can take that sample anytime you would like and send it off to the lab to capture that information. As Gabe acknowledged, I mean, these soils, are loaded with a lot of nutrient with inside of them, So it's kind of a good aha that, just seeing you have maybe a 5,000 to 6,000 pounds of nitrogen you weren't even aware of within that 12-inch soil profile. In the aggregate stability test, a lot of times I'll capture that the same time I do my Haney soils test, just because I'm sending the sample off. You can do that any time of year per se, definitely maybe through the end of the growing season, or maybe you start planting a cover crop, or whatever the case may be. It can be pulled pretty much any time you would like.
And so would you say that these are all kind of a once a year report card that you're taking for yourself?
The Haney, I would, if you're going to start this journey, I would do the Haney year over year, same conditions, similar conditions, same time of year. The PLFA, I don't know if I would do that every year. I would do a baseline, so I had a baseline where we started, but maybe repeat that every third year just to see the advancements of the diversity of the microbiology. The TND, that's pretty much just one and done capture. The aggregate stability, you could look at that as a baseline first time, then maybe, do that every third year to see the progression within the soil.
And they're all sent off? Is that right?
Yes. So just acknowledge, if you do capture your soil sampling, so Haney soils test, it's not like per se a grid sample test. So I always tell individuals, let's say you have a quarter 160 acre field, I might split that in half, and I'll do a north half, south half, but I'll collect soil samples from maybe 5 to 8 locations in that half. 3 to 5 samples per location, 6 inches deep, put them in a bucket. And once I capture all my collections in the bucket, I'll stir it up and send it off as one composite sample. Especially if it's been managed the same type of crops, for several years. If we do see a dramatic difference in elevation, maybe soil type dramatic differences, we will collect those separately. But most often, just splitting the field in half and capture north half, south half, east half, west half, however you decided to divide it.
And you would recommend that for all these tests, basically? That same strategy?
The PLFA, the Haney and the PLFA, I would. The TND, I might just pick 2 or 3 locations and, pull 12-inch core samples. Sure.
And so I think that one objection that gets raised to these kinds of things is that's expensive or I don't have time to do that. Well, just spend one less day applying nutrients and you'll save yourself some money and you'll open up a day to go and get this done. Obviously that's tongue in cheek.
That's a great point, Clay. But one thing we do when we work with clients is when we get this information back, obviously we look at what we have for soluble nutrients. We look at the CO2 respirations, the diversity of biology. What we're going to do, we don't want someone to, we're going to look at that and we're going to encourage, maybe doing your normal nutrient application Let's look at some reductions, check strips. Then we're also going to encourage one small area of a zero check. And we want to compare all three of those tests in the production, but more we want to look at the net dollars. Was it worth applying that extra 30 units of nitrogen maybe to your normal nutrient application, but where you're able to reduce by 30 units? Maybe it was 5 bushels off because you justified the additional 30 units. And what we've seen where we've been doing testing is as we start the reduction, the production doesn't vary very much at all. It's still net profitable, but we start seeing a greater response in the soil microbiology, the respirations within those soils. So there is an unintended consequence with over-application. Mm-hmm. It reduces some of that soil microbiome.
Yeah, and as we start moving producers onto lower and lower amounts of inputs, that stimulates the biology to propagate and make up that void. And that's the only way we're going to build the health of these ecosystems back.
So yeah, there's a process. To say it somewhat negatively, it's a weaning process. To say it fairly negatively, it's a detox process. We're like drug addicts. We've got to detox from these addictions. And if you try to do it cold turkey, there's going to be some serious consequences. So we need to make sure that we've kind of got that process, that we understand that it's going to be a process before we just dive off and rip the Band-Aid off and tell the input salesman to, go pound sand. And right. And you guys have been walking people through that process over the last number of years, right?
And there's no greater reward, and I'll speak and let Gabe, but then working with a client and moving them through this journey, and when they start reducing nutrients significantly, then they call you that fall or a couple of years into it and saying, man, I'm down to half a unit of N per bushel of corn. And, that's very rewarding. I mean, that we built confidence into that client.
If I may, Clay, expand on one other way that producers can start saving themselves some money. And this is hard for many producers to comprehend and understand, but most producers, only 40 to 50% of the nutrients they apply are going to be taken up by that crop the year they apply it. Okay. The rest is there. It's either going to volatilize away or it's going to be moved throughout the soil profile, being washed into the watershed, etc. So a producer's goal should be, how do I hold those nutrients on my land? I paid for them. I wrote the check. I should keep them on my land. So one of the things we strongly recommend is growing cover crops after a cash crop. Now, I fully understand, we've been very dry here the past 3 years. I understand producers saying, well, I don't have time, they'll say, to get a cover crop established. Well, I'm sorry, you don't have time not to get a cover crop established because you can't go out there and combine in an early morning anyway. You might as well hop on a tractor and seed a cover crop. Now, if you're in a drought situation, what we've been recommending to our clients, those in, western South Dakota, North Dakota, and into Montana in these very dry past years, is simply as you're combining, turn the wind up a little bit or open the sieves just a little bit and blow some of that lighter seed out the back. It'll germinate, and at least you have a growing plant out there. But what that's doing then is that plant or the cover crop you seed is going down and it's capturing a lot of those nutrients that were not used by your cash crop. Shane talked about immobilization. That's what's happening. We're immobilizing those nutrients, moving it into a living plant. That plant then will die come frost, winter, and then the next spring, the biology will will mineralize those nutrients and they'll be available. That is a way for a farmer rancher to realize significant dollar savings. And they're going to say, well, that cover crop costs me money. Yes, that seed and fuel, it does cost you money, but you can grow your own seed. This isn't rocket science. One of the things we do on our ranch, we grow a few fields of barley, oats, peas, and flax together. We seed it together, combine it together. That's our cover crop seed. Boy, it's easy. Just stick an auger in a bin, auger some out, and go seed. And I've got living plants. Then, of course, the ultimate reward is here come the cattle, here come the sheep, here come the chickens, whatever else may be. And, those cattle come December, January, you'll be surprised how much snow they can go through to get to that stuff.
Yeah. So how do we design those cover crops? You talk about, establishing those cover crops to be there when the whatever crop is growing is harvested. What are some of the kind of rules that you guys use or guiding principles that you guys use as far as designing cover crops?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing, what are your resource concerns? That's going to be one question. We're going to look at addressing, one of the beauties of the Haney soils test, it gives us a couple other pieces of information. It tells us what the carbon to nitrogen ratio is in the soil. So we like to see a carbon to nitrogen ratio kind of ideally of a 10-to-1 to 12-to-1. And we kind of see where that carbon to nitrogen ratio is. And, a lot of times we'll see ratios well out of kilter, maybe like a 7.5-to-1. So 7.5 parts to carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So that system's, screaming out to us that we need to get more carbon into it. So we'll look at our cover crop mix and help, design to provide more carbon. Or if we see a carbon to nitrogen ratio of 20 to 1 or greater, that's telling us there's a lack of nitrogen within that soil structure. So we are going to provide more nitrogen through legume to help offset the carbon within the soil. But more specifically, we use these cover crop mixes and the Haney soils test, to help determine how do we build up more microbial biomass in the soil. So a lot of times, definitely in annual systems, especially individuals starting out, we'll see a high percentage of a legume to a grass, like a 40 to 50% legume to 50% grass. And the reasoning behind that is the legume plants are a low carbon to nitrogen, so they decompose really easily, quickly, and bacteria can break that down. So it helps build up the microbial bacterial biomass within the soils. But we still need carbon being provided to feed the increased population of the bacteria and the soil microbiology. So, but as we start getting CO2 respirations up in our soils, we start getting greater than 100 parts per million or greater, we'll start reducing that legume component and providing more carbon to feed the soil microbiology. So the Haney soils test provides a lot of information, but one of the things we will look at consulting is what resource concerns are we trying to address? Are we trying to build more armor on the soil? Are we trying to provide more diversity within the soil to feed different soil microbiology? Are we needing feed for livestock? So are we trying to keep a living root in the soil? So there's a lot of factors that goes into cover crop mixes and designs also. But one thing I want to mention here real quick so I don't forget it, because a lot of people misinterpret this. If you do a Haney soils test and you see a percentage, 40% legumes to 60% grass, early on people interpret that as pounds per acre. What we like to do, usually whatever your biannual seeding rates are, so if you're planting 1 million seeds per acre of wheat, you want to go off that seed count, the same with your cover crop mix. Now that's going to be also region dependent. If you're in more brittle environments, a lot of times we'll back that off even further just because we don't have the aggregation of soil, the water infiltration just to get a living root and some biomass grown.
Yep. I just need to add a little bit there. You always have to take into account herbicide restrictions. You know, when you're seeding cover crops, what herbicides were applied, that we've seen some real issues there if you're not careful. And then we also pay attention to, of course, what cash crop are you going to seed next in that particular field? Because we need to make sure that there isn't any carryover seed that didn't germinate, or if cover crops go to seed, we don't want to have that become an issue in the subsequent cash crop.
And I mean, that herbicide is residual from previous year or years. Is that right?
Certainly can be. Some of these herbicides that are being applied in these mixes can carry over for at least 2 full years. You know, we need to be cognizant of that.
Sure. And I mean, I think, you know, what we just talked about as far as designing cover crop mixes really goes to the point of the importance of these soil tests. You got to know what's there before you know what am I going to put down as far as a cover crop is concerned. Is that kind of how these two things are related?
Yes. I mean, and we've seen in instances where the wrong cover crop mix is applied, and in fact, you'll really inhibit soil function. You know, early on, when I started down this journey, you know, the radishes and the turnips were the big thing, you know, and we planted copious amounts of them. And, you know, really, it was not very beneficial to our soil function. So really, we inhibited advancements of the succession of the soil by planting the wrong cover crop mixes. So we really encourage producers to really make sure you have reputable seed companies you're dealing with, representatives, you know, that have your best interest at heart, because there's a lot of things you can get into with these cover crop seeds and mixes and the wrong mixes. And, you know, I don't know how many times we've heard, you know, somebody will tell us they planted cover crop mixes in the past. Well, they were the wrong cover crop mix to address the resource concern they were trying to achieve.
And maybe, Clay, I could just give an example of that. So I had a call one March morning from a producer from South Dakota, and he said that he had an issue with cover crops. They failed him. And I said, okay, explain what you mean. And he said, well, I have irrigated land, and I had winter wheat growing on there. I combined the winter wheat. I baled off the straw. I seeded radishes and turnips, put some water on, got beautiful growth, turned the cattle on there, and the cattle were on there for a good part of the winter. And I just interrupted him. I said, I'll stop you right there. Let me guess. Now here it is March, and you've got bare soil, and your soil's starting to blow. And he says, well, how did you know? I said, you planted exactly the wrong cover crop for your resource concern. There's always going to be some residual nitrogen following a wheat crop. You removed all the above ground biomass when you took the straw off. Radishes and turnips, being brassicas, are nitrogen accumulators. They scavenged and sucked up that extra nitrogen in the soil. You had the cattle in there. They grazed off what little biomass there was from the radish and turnip tops. As the temperature started warming up, the biology went crazy on those tubers, and then it released all that nitrogen, and the biology needed carbon. It had the nitrogen. It started eating the carbon compounds in those soil aggregates, and now his soil was blown. I said, your cover crop didn't fail you. You failed the plan. He should have put a grass-based cover crop on that field, and that would have then it would have scavenged the nitrogen. And then also, you know, he needs to do a better job of grazing management. We can't just turn livestock onto these fields, cover crop fields, and let them graze all the above ground biomass.
Yeah, because ultimately they will be selective grazers if you let them, and they'll go after what they like first and what is the most nutrient dense thing first, and then those things are not there to hold the soil in place. So when we talk about carbon and carbon nitrogen ratios, carbon comes from armor on the soil. Am I right? That you're putting down that litter on the soil, and eventually the biology takes that and incorporates it into the soil structure. Is that how that works?
Well, a portion of it, if I may, Shane, a portion of it, 2/3 of your organic matter or carbon increase will actually come from the roots, the dying, decaying roots, and the biology that feed off of them. Correct, Shane?
Correct. So, carbon, a lot of the carbon we talk about is really the root exudate carbon that's being provided when the plant's photosynthesizing. And then a lot of the carbon, is also through microbial biomass. Some of that carbon does come from the above ground residues cycled back through the soil itself. But, carbon and nitrogen, there's two things we want to look at. So the Haney soils test is looking at carbon to nitrogen ratios below ground. There's a carbon to nitrogen ratio at the above ground biomass itself. So there's another test we do with producers. It's called the cover crop biomass test. Basically, it's a clipping. Usually it's a 3x3 area of the above ground vegetation. We send that off to the lab, and we see how much nutrients immobilized within inside of that biomass, that cover crop. And, remarkably, most people are surprised of how much nutrient is immobilized. I have seen as high as 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre immobilized in a cover crop. Last year, I've seen some, around 70 to 90 pounds of nitrogen. So when we think about that, when we talk about carbon and nitrogen above ground, we're going to take into fact, when do we need to cycle that nitrogen, that nutrient, back for that next production crop? So that's what Gabe was talking about earlier, is what your crop rotation is going to look like in your cover crop mixes. Because if I have too much carbon in my system, let's say a cereal like cereal rye, and I'm planting corn to that, and that cereal rye gets up to antithesis, that's a very high carbon to nitrogen ratio vegetation. So it's not going to decompose and cycle those nutrients, mineralize it soon enough when that corn plant really is demanding that excess nitrogen or extra nitrogen. So really it probably it's going to tie up nitrogen for us. But if I was planting soybeans into a high carbon to nitrogen, like the cereal rye, as I gave an example at antithesis, that decomposition is going to occur later in the season, mineralizing that nutrient that's tied up in that cover crop when that soybean plant is probably going to need it. Like my part of the world here in Kansas, that latter part of July, early part of August, and we're going to cycle that additional nutrient and be captured by the soybean and help with production. Now, are we going to cycle all that nutrient that's bound up into that biomass above ground? No, we're probably not, but we're going to cycle a percentage of that back through the system. As we increase the soil health, the microbiological diversity, we're going to capture a greater percentage of that and cycle it back when we need it. So it goes back to the early question about the nutrient cycle.
Yep.
Going from immobilization of nutrients, mineralizing it, but it's really kind of, determining when we need that nutrient demand for the next production crop and balancing that cover crop mix based upon that carbon and nitrogen.
And is that part of the role of livestock, to be a tool that we can use to time the return of those nutrients back there? They can play a role in influencing the timing of that. Is that part of how they are operating in these systems?
They can be, probably more specifically the biology. Well, let me back up just a second. The livestock are really going to help with moving microbiology through the system. It depends on how we manage it and graze, we bring a livestock in. As Gabe mentioned, way too often, many individuals, we overgraze that, we remove that armor off of that soil. So we're not going to cycle that back. Yeah, cycled back through the animal, through manure paths. But if the animals are continuously grazing, where's that manure urine going to be distributed? As we use, polywire, move the animals through the field, we're going to help that uniformity of the manure and urine that we can capture back again for the next production crop.
And I don't think that we could ever say that manure and urine are a replacer for armor on the soil, right? If we take too much armor, right, you can't replace it by putting more manure and urine on the soil.
Right. But as Dr. Williams discussed in the last podcast, that the livestock are cycling biology. By that, I mean, as Shane said, they're transferring biology, they're moving it, they're shedding biology. The microorganisms in the gut of animals is closely related to that in the soil. And it's that symbiotic relationship that we need. And where we are able to incorporate livestock, we can significantly advance soil health even further as compared to where they are not.
Right. Yeah, and that's we have to have things repeated 7 times, I think, before we remember them, right? And so this marks 3 episodes we've talked about the fact that there's going to be a ceiling on your soil health if you're not incorporating livestock. And so we got 4 more to go.
Yeah.
Or probably every one of the Working Cows podcast episodes. We just talk about that. They're good. I really appreciate you guys' time today. A couple of things that kind of hit me as we were working through this early on is we don't want to farm naked. We want our roots to have clothes on them. We want our roots to be covered in the silt and soil, sand, aggregates on the roots, and we want to pull them. When we pull them out, we don't want them to be naked, and we want them to be covered. So there's another part of what we're shooting for, in a way that we can kind of analyze these things and say, how are we doing with nutrient management? Anything else that we were hoping to cover today?
I don't know if we can ever emphasize this enough, is, really, if you're wanting to start down this journey, really getting back to no-till practices, minimizing that disruption in the soil, that's the first step you've got to get right. The second one, is really getting that soil armor covered. That water is too precious. We got to keep that moisture in the soil to allow that biology to function and allow that decomposition to start. So, we really got to get those 2 steps right first, and then we can start progressing ourselves, adding diversity, looking at rotations, keeping that living root, and then adding the animals, is very important and critical. But I will, from being on hundreds of farms and ranches and seeing grazing activities, it's sometimes maybe we need to get that armor right first. Let's get that right first. And then let's look at bringing animals in once we know we can do a good job with that.
Yep. 634, Clay, 634.
Yep. And I've been shocked how many times I've asked experts and kind of pitched hypothetical scenarios to them. And when it comes down to pretty much any choice over sacrificing armor on the soil, almost every one of them will say, keep the armor on the soil. whatever the other scenario was, they said keep the armor on the soil. And so
it's a precious resource.
Yep. And so don't want to burn through it. So all right, guys, thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate you guys taking the time, and very much looking forward to future conversations with the Understanding Ag team.
Thank you, Clay. Great to be with you.
Thank you.
Very good. A lot to chew on there, a lot to think about, a lot to consider. Very practical. Really appreciate the way they communicate those things, and looking forward to the next episode of the Working Cows podcast coming your way real soon. We will have a conversation with Troy Hadrick of North Prairie Butchery. Talked to Troy Hadrick a long time ago on the podcast about GeneMax testing and about pairing sires and dams for the purpose of carcass merits and some of those things. Well, recently, him and his wife have embarked on an adventure to start a USDA inspected beef, pork, and bison processing facility near their hometown of Fulton, South Dakota. We're going to talk to them about that. Their goal is to be able to process 25 head per day. We're going to talk to Troy about this journey and about what he's been learning about the beef industry through this journey, and some of those things coming up real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.